Thank you. So hi everyone. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Razi Reis. I'm a senior product manager in Microsoft Security Customer Experience Engineering team. I'm part of the Entra Customer Acceleration team. So I'm super excited to be here, talk about the deployment considerations. Um, in this session specifically, we're going to be looking at the deployment from the external identity, customer identity standpoint with security first deployment lens. So we're going to be focusing quite a bit around security. And as you can imagine, there is no shortage of things there. So what you see on the screen here is sort of like the agenda. This is the technical session. Although I'm not assuming that you have a background in external identity, so I'm going to be calling out things that will help you level set throughout the session. So we're going to basically look into what are the key considerations when it comes to thinking about deploying your, for example, user experience and what modalities exist in the external identity space for you to do that securely, and what should you be considering. You basically going to think about user model and attribute extensibility, like why that is important, how you should think about it from a deployment standpoint. Operational monitoring is another critical area that, I mean, basically looking into your environment, what's going on, what are the areas where you should be looking deeper into, and things like that. So I'm going to talk about both out-of-the-box features and some areas where you can extend the functionality through the features that we provide. So we'll take questions at the end. I will try my best to have enough time so I can take all of them. But if I don't, then I apologize in advance. Um, so let's jump right into it. And because some of you may not be coming from the customer identity space background or SIAM, let's talk a little bit about like why and how customer identities are different from, let's say, workforce identities or employees identity or B2E scenarios. So they are fundamentally different when you look at the different areas in between those. For example, business focus is usually very different. When you think about the workforce identities, you are mainly thinking about like employees. Their need is usually to make sure that they get in the most secure fashion. Usually, the interactions are pretty consistent, very standardized throughout the organizations, and the requirements around those are pretty much driven by the business needs. So if the business is basically on the, let's say, banking sector, they will have their own requirements, but it will be very standard. You get in, you sign in, use the collaboration tools and whatnot. From the customer identity standpoint, things are quite different because businesses usually range. There's a huge like range of business needs. For example, if you're talking about like a retail customer and they're thinking about implementing customer identities, they will be thinking about, well, hey, I mean, we wanted to go live with this particular work stream, and we wanted to make sure that we can acquire as many customers as soon as possible in the most secure fashion. So they're looking at monthly active user or daily active user count as one of the key metrics. They're not interested that those users necessarily going to sign in and go to and check their email on the platform. They're mainly interested in getting in, let's say, their e-commerce to perform some transaction on them. They're really looking into growing their business and having a platform that can support that. Now, with that, the challenges from deployment standpoint and from security standpoint also, they're different because if you think about the same scenario that I was talking about, like onboarding an employee, for example, right, in your workforce, well, you typically know the employee very well upfront. And there's usually a in the recruitment process, pretty substantial vetting, and that's part of the identity proofing that happens at that time. And then there are other features in the platform, like in the Entra, that entirely align with that. Um, the challenge really in the customer identity space is that when you wanted to onboard, um, users and you wanted to have them with the most frictionless fashion, you really don't know them. I mean, there's a lot of like self assertion going on at that point. And you want to make sure that you don't get what we call like a fraudulent accounts. I mean, that's a prevalent problem in the industry. So identity proofing and identity creations are different. I mean, because you're doing so much self-service, you wanted to have the signups, which are basically viral, very easy, but you also want them to be secure. So I think that's sort of like a balancing act that is very different. On the workforce side, once you account is created and you get access to the packages, I mean, things become very streamlined, and that sort of like luxury you don't have in the customer identity space. And you will see that as we get more into the details that play actually quite a big role in your decision making. And finally, the branding needs. And we're going to cover this piece into the seamless integration and authentication. Um, the branding needs are actually quite different because when you talk about your public facing, both native applications like mobile experiences for your consumers and also uh, the traditional web experience, right? You want a white label solution. You want to make sure that totally the whole identity, like sign up, sign in flow, like integrates seamlessly in your existing application flows. So it basically need to meet and match the expectation of branding and customization of a particular work stream. Like, if you're launching like an e-commerce, like a retail, you want to have that rich branding experiences. The workforce side, typically from the employee, there's a very standard way of looking at. You have a logo, you have a branding. Definitely, there's a richness required, but I think inherently within the same organization, from a customer identity standpoint, you may have a drastically different need. The modalities are very different. So when you're going to think about the deployment and the considerations around them, you will see that these are going to be the theme behind that, hey, I need to plan in a way that I end up with the best solution, but also, in a way that it's frictionless, it's more secure, it's customizable, I can monitor it to understand what's going on. If something happened, I should have a way to remediate that. So we're gonna talk about that throughout the session. So the first thing I really wanted to get started with is from the external identity standpoint is securing the edge and what that means. Basically, what happens is when you go and land on a page, for example, for sign in, you basically go through certain hoops, you ultimately arrive on the page. At that point, it's basically pre-auth. Like, I mean, anyone can send a request to the metadata endpoints or the public authentication endpoints. And that's by design. If you're using standard protocols, I mean, you need to have those endpoints open. Now, that's great. But what is challenging is that the attacks like DDoS and particularly driven by bots, they are extremely prevalent in the industry, and they can basically come and go. But what you will see is they are sort of like sprinkled across in different areas. So you can have like a traditional layer 3, layer 7 DDoS. You will have like sophisticated attacks like on the SMS, like IRSF attack. There's a very prevalent attack in the SMS space, which is old PSTN telephony, for example, if you're using account takeover, sign up abuse, for example, just having these bots creating fraudulent accounts. So what you really wanted to do is that before even the sign up or the sign in actually kick start, you wanted to make sure that you vet every request and make sure that it's not fraudulent. And the best way to do that is going to basically use is a WAF, which is a web application firewall, as a first layer of defense. So you'll see that when you're thinking about like planning for deployment, um, having multiple layer of defense are absolutely critical, and it will give you the best overall protection. So in this diagram that you're seeing right now, it's a very simple flow. So user is coming in, opening their browser, getting into their particular website, and then they will go eventually to for the login. And at that point, before they actually go and get into the external identity, like the authorization, the authentication page or endpoint, you will basically have the web application firewall. So this web application firewall, right, from a security standpoint, when you plan for deployment, right, what would be the key controls that you're looking at? Now, there's the list, I mean, can go much longer, but I do wanted to highlight some of the things that we find um, that is extremely effective against protecting certain type of attacks. So the first thing is really the bot protection. So um, enabling bot protection actually going to relieve you from later on from a lot of other headaches. So having a really good bot protection, which is basically allow users to do, for example, things like advanced captcha or basically captcha that are not necessarily going to be burdensome. So it's going to be based on device fingerprinting like JS, or they're going to be managed. They're only going to put you through a certain checks when they feel, due to the machine learning that they're using, that you need to be put into that situation where you need to prove that that you're a legitimate user and not a bot. So having a bot protection is also important from the DDoS attack prevention, because DDoS can happen in many ways, not just by bot, but they actually are one of the key drivers through that. So there's a layer 3, layer 7, technically, they're different, but ultimately the result is that the actual endpoint will be stressed out. So top two concerns that need to be met by WAF is these two. Now, when you think about the actual business use case, you can actually fine tune a lot of things. For example, if you're running a business in North America, are you expecting the same or similar number of requests coming from other regions? Now, keep in mind that people travel these days, and they may be working remotely. So you can think about like requests coming in across the globe, but if your major business is anchor, for example, in North America, you will expect like 90% or 90% of the requests are coming from this region. So you fine tune WAF ruling for that. So for example, you look at the data and you say that, well, if the requests are coming from particular region, you can probably, limit the number of requests per second. You can even have like a specific security controls. So it's sort of like a broad range of things you can do with it. But the idea is that your business know what is really the need of the user, right? So if you don't necessarily have a large demographic coming from certain region, you can do that. Now, how do you do that technically? I mean, in the WAF space, you can do it through the geofencing, you can do it through the IP ASN. So it's kind of like depending what going to be a best fit solution. But those two are also very good to go and configure upfront. Another thing is the rate limiting. So usually there are things like OWASP rule suits, so you can basically go and use the rule set from the OWASP. The idea here is that if you are not expecting on a certain endpoint a certain number of requests, then you can put an advanced rate limiting there. Advanced rate limiting is like it can basically modulate, like it can fluctuate, but after a certain amount of time, when the requests are coming in during a certain period, it will basically going to limit it. And how it limited, it can actually put something like a advanced check, so you can prove that you're not a bot, or it can downright block. So it's sort of like depends where you want to take it. So these are some of the considerations that you wanted to start with. Now, ultimately, the user going to land into a page. This is a customer, identity access management solution, right? So you're basically going to think about how to secure that, and it has to be seamless. So typically, the challenge in the security is how to do this in the most frictionless manner, yet making sure that it's most secure, right? So it's sort of like a traditionally attention. So spend a lot of time on the external identity side to bring the best of the both worlds. So the first thing that is really important in uh, environments when you need heavy customization, very rich branding, is to make sure that the experiences from the application standpoint, and in this case, what you're seeing on the screen right now is a web app. Again, very common, very predominant use case. And then on the left hand side, you're seeing the login page. It basically aligned very well. In this case, example of a grocery store. This is kind of an ability that you need, because you should be able to have a full fidelity experience. So when the users are interacting, they shouldn't be noticing that you're actually removed from the experience that provided by a particular vendor, right? So that's one of the key requirements. Now, traditionally, this has been the key requirement, but in the last decade or so, because of the influx of mobile first, now one of the things that is absolutely necessary is to provide full native device experiences. For example, if you're using iOS, Android, you shouldn't be experiencing something like a web view popping up and you're going in and you can do it, but the idea is that you should able to have like an API first native experience where you can actually perform the same, sign up and sign in ultimately. And the developers will have full control to implement that. So you can basically add things to it, you can remove things from the UX. You're not necessarily, for example, relying on the user flow provided by the external identity. So these two approaches actually give you a lot more freedom to plan for the deployment, because if you have a need, you're launching a web application and then you have a native mobile experience with that, which is very common in the customer identity space. This is really the feature to look at. Now, these two features go hand in hand. They're not mutually exclusive. They're actually majority of the time, you'll be using both. But from a deployment standpoint, I think you need to think about what each of these modality brings to the table, and you need to plan accordingly. So what I did here is put some of the key considerations. I mean, it's not a holistic list, but I think this is something that that you may want to do, zoom in a little bit more on a day one when you're thinking about using either one of these. So first of all is the ultimate user experience, right? With the web view that I showed you, is basically a browser-based authentication, right? You can have that integrated in your mobile experiences, like the native mobile experiences. You can do that. And you may need to do it for some legacy reasons, but that's not the ideal experience. That's where the native authentication really shines. I mean, you get the full control. It's an API first environment, so it's all REST-based, so you can basically go. And it's also supporting the protocols like the OIDC. So it's basically fully compatible with that. So you get to choose. Now, the customization experience is really the area where native authentication, you have like full fidelity. Um, the the thing that you need to think about though is from a maintenance standpoint, for example, the web experience is hosted on, it's basically Entra External identity hosted for you, right? So in that case, it's totally SaaS. You go and you customize it. But from a native authentication standpoint, because you are going to build on top of the API that external identity provide, you will need to maintain that. Now, that is not different from any other type of development that you do, but you have to now take into account that if there are SDK updates, there are things like that, the new feature added. So you need to make sure that you're top of that. With the user flow, I mean, once things are there and you customize them, Microsoft is maintaining them. We are making sure that everything is up to speed there. Another thing from a development standpoint, if you have a team and they're looking into it, of course, when you have the user flow, you support like pretty much all major frameworks. For the native authentication, there's a SDK for the Android and the iOS, because it's a native authentication, you can have that. But if you wanted to even take control beyond that, you want to just go and totally drive it in your way, you can do that with the REST APIs that actually work behind the scenes. So there's no secret sauce. You can actually do it yourself. Since you're talking about the sort of like the application side of things, I do wanted to call out from a deployment standpoint, do plan for the secrets and the credential management, because whenever you're going to go and make an application live on external identity, you will need to go and anchor that into external identity. And what I mean is that you will create an application inside the Entra tenant, external identity tenant. Now, when you do that, you will be required to do certain things. And from a credential standpoint, first of all, I mean, avoid secrets if you can. Use the X509 certificates. They're easier to rotate. You can they provide much more information. So it's just generally speaking with the existing PKI, they align very well, public interface infrastructure, right? PKI. So that's really important. Now, if you have to use secrets, then make sure that the expiry, having a too longer of a date is a problem. Generally speaking, secrets are not great in a way that they can be shared, less control over them. So it's sort of like comes with the extra management or governance challenge with that. Another thing that is very important, if you're using or building on the public client, so public client going to be, for example, a mobile app. So technically in the OAuth world, it will be categorized as a public client. Now, if you are building a public client actually are do not require credentials. They don't require secrets because the interface through which you're going to be talking to, that protocol will be doesn't require any secrets because the device itself is considered not secure. Now, what happen is traditionally, like the way you're creating the apps, you may be testing them and you create these secrets, and that is something that can become stale and never get noticed. So this is something that you should also think about from a deployment practices. Like if you have a public client app, do not add um, secrets or certificate to them. This is just no need for them. The other thing is that audit the credentials, because I mean you may need credentials today, you may need secrets today, but are they rotated? Are they maybe close to expiry? Maybe the app was created for testing, no longer needed that. So purge that. I mean, if it doesn't need it, it shouldn't be there. Now with that, let's talk a little bit about the user model and the attribute extensibility side. Now this is something that practically most of the deployments will need. So you need to think about it carefully because there are multiple options on the table. And from a deployment standpoint, you should think about like where and how you wanted to approach this. So first of all, what it is about. So within the Entra External ID tenant, when you create the tenant and when you have the user in it, the directory will have built-in attributes. So the given name, first name, last name, it's a full list that we provide. Now, typically that is good enough, and they are persisted and stored in the directory. You don't really ever have to think about like maintaining them. They're there, and for most part, I mean that's about it. Now, in some cases, you will find yourself in a place where you wanted to go and create custom attributes. For example, you wanted to have something like a particular account number. You may wanted to store specific details about the user that are not provided by the default attributes, right? So you can actually go ahead and create those attributes. They make sure that you look at all the existing out of the box attribute first before you start creating custom attributes. Again, when you create something custom, you do need to maintain that overall, like in a long run. So the criteria should really be that if something is not available, then go ahead and create one. Now, there's another decision that you can make, which is very interesting. So should you create a attribute, or should you look at something called the custom authentication extensions? Now, custom authentication extensions are really flexible way. At a very high level, you can think about them as a webhook. So while you're actually signing up or signing in, and let's say you wanted to go ahead and with the token that you're sending back to the application, during the signing process, you wanted to go ahead and call a downstream API, which may be interacting with a custom proprietary database. And then you basically take and augment the token with extra attributes. Now, in this particular case, you're not necessarily wanted to store them because you don't want to use directory, as a database either. So if there's a need that you wanted to attach extra pieces of information, then you can actually go and have a REST API. You can call it and you can get the attributes from the source that you want. Now, that will give you a lot of flexibility, but as we know that with that kind of flexibility, you have to think about some considerations. So what I did here, I just wanted to call out some of the considerations, like when you think about approaching this. So I think the rule of thumb should be that use out of the box attributes wherever possible. There's actually quite a lot. Sometimes, when I talk to customers, they get surprised how much is offered out of the box. Now, if that is not sufficient, go ahead and create a custom attribute. Now, when you're going to use them, make sure that you have a naming convention. You don't want the person coming after you to be so hands down, like everyone have their own pattern of looking at things. So document them, have them. This is again nothing is specific from the naming standpoint. Like you can choose whatever naming convention you want, but have a naming convention. It goes a long way when you have more than few of these attributes. Another thing that you should think about is that if the external source is available, and that is something that you're going to maintain, and if you're talking about like multiple custom attributes, they are extremely dynamic, and you're not necessarily sure that after a certain time you will need them in the same way. Maybe the naming will change, maybe the business need will change, so you don't necessarily want to bring them over into and start creating them into the directory, into the tenant itself. So what you can do in that particular case, you can go ahead and implement what is known as the custom authentication extension. So on the left hand side of the diagram, you see like a canonical flow. What happened when you actually go ahead and make a call to a custom extension for the custom attributes and the out of the box attributes. I mean, they're just red. You can select them, you can configure them, and that's about it. Like there's no necessarily development required. For the custom extension, from a deployment standpoint, you do need to think about a few things. And I'm calling out three key things. One is the scale, security, and resiliency. So you need to think about all those three axes. From a scale standpoint, this is the area where you have to be careful because the Entra External Identity will support the RPS, for example, right? I'm going to talk about service limits towards the end, but I mean it's publicly documented. When it's scale, it's a SaaS service, so it basically know how to deal with that. Now, keep in mind that if your sign-in flow, sign-up flow going to go and implement the custom extension because you wanted to bring those extra pieces of information, it should able to scale like that. Because think about it, at the end of the day, it would be the weakest link problem. So if you go all the way till the end and the last step was actually go ahead and make a call, that's what happens. So in this particular case, custom extensions, you can do it through the sign up, you can block the sign up, you can enrich the sign up experience, or you can use them for the sign in to just basically go ahead and take all the information, send it back, and then as part of the final JOT issuance, you basically add claims to it. Now, if that step is blocked because the downstream API is not available, maybe it's not scaling, well, you have a challenge there because your actual experience of sign up and sign in is now broken, and user may not able to sign up or sign in. So it's going to have direct impact on your user experience. So that's number one. Number two is from the security standpoint, on the API side, you can actually tighten it up. I mean, the APIs will be getting a call from external ID, and the IP range is well documented. So you can actually tune that. You can actually tighten it up. So you don't want it to allow that API to just allow anyone. It should be, sort of like taking control of that and, only allow IP range that Microsoft hold. So because the request will coming from the external identity, which is coming from Microsoft data center, so you can do that. The other thing is the overall resiliency that I was talking about. So this is something that you should really think about from other aspects. So overall, this REST API will exist outside external identity. So what resiliency look like? What is the uptime? What is the quality of service? Things like that. And the most important thing is that when you make these calls, there's a graceful recovery that is required. So I mean, if let's say it wasn't able to respond, then it should still respond that, okay, maybe busy, send the HTTP response, regular response back. So at least the workflow, the user flow can actually continue. So again, I will provide link to the document, talk in detail about like how to plan about it. But these are some of the things that will come in. Now, again, very powerful feature, and you should be using it if needed, but requires some careful thought process. Okay, now let's talk about the end user security. Now, this is basically we're talking about the experiences, we're talking about considerations there. What about the actual end user, right? When you try to sign in, what are the challenges there? And from a deployment standpoint, what you should be thinking about? So one of the things that you should think about is where most of the attacks happen, right? And who drives those attacks. So let's talk about the sign up. I briefly mentioned that at the start of the session today that the customer identities are different inherently because you need proofing. You don't really know. I mean, anyone can technically go and land on the sign up page. So how would you make sure that you make sure that it's a legitimate user and not a fraudulent? So fraud protection is a key problem. And I mentioned the IRSF attack. IRSF attack is basically a type of attack which, if you have allow SMS for, let's say, MFA, the attacker will actually put in a number, and that number going to be a premium number. So let's say, a regular call cost X cents, then the actual call to that premium number will call Y dollars. So there's a huge difference between the two. And ultimately, the cost will incur because, you're making the call. Now, the most interesting thing is that attackers are usually not concerned about completing the flow. They're mainly interested in making the call that actually going to bring them the revenue. So this is called the international revenue share fraud. Nothing is specific to external identity. It's just a generic attack that exists in the wild, and it's just because of the way the PSTN systems and the systems that come after that sort of like build on top of each other. So it's just there inherently. So we're going to talk about that, how to think about it and mitigate that. Then you have the range of attacks when you use the passwords. Now you can use the email OTP. It's a better option compared to password. But if you are using, then you think about like how to look at the password spread and the brute force attacks. Again, these are done by the bots mostly. So that preventing against bots is again very critical here in this space. And there are many more, but I think I wanted to call out a few, and then we're going to look into how you should approach these. So I think when it comes to the holistic security, thinking about it from the angle of both proactive and reactive is the best way. So what would be the proactive way of doing it? Well, proactive way would be that you have the bot protection. So every time when the sign up is starting up, that the particular request is, we have a high level of confidence, not fraudulent. It's not a bot base. So the first layer of defense can be a WAF, web application firewall. It's a great way to block that kind of a traffic before it can arrive on the page. So again, one of the themes here is that when you're thinking about deployment, try to stop the malicious request before it even land on the page. The further it is from the tenant, the better it is. So web application firewall actually runs on the edge, which is really, really effective way of dealing with that. Now, again, nothing is 100%, so there will be some requests coming in. So what will be the second layer? The second layer of defense, there are a few things you can do. Conditional access policies with adaptive MFA is a good way. So you basically wanted to have definitely not one factor, multiple factors, and then you make sure that you tighten it up in a way that you either block the incoming request if you think there is enough suspicion, or you enforce the MFA. So it's just not one factor that the user sign-in experience rely on. For example, for the password attacks, you definitely wanted to have the MFA. The other thing is that knowing where to go and look, and this is something that you want, right? So in the Entra External ID, I will talk about that towards a little bit in the end. We'll talk about the operational side of it. We do provide telemetry out of the box, and we have some dashboards, but the reality is that from a business standpoint, you also need to think about where I should be focusing on. So I think having the alerting and monitoring capability, so there's the out of the box integration with Azure Monitor that you can do, that is really good. So let's talk a little bit more deeper into it from a deployment standpoint. So I mentioned the web application firewall, which is particularly talking about the bot protection from the sign-in and the sign-up protection standpoint, because that's where the bot targets a lot, and that would be your first layer of defense. Because usually these attacks are done at a scale. Typically, the revenue doesn't really come if you do one-off attacks. So there has to be some botnet involved there. So that should be your first layer of defense. The second layer of defense is really that Microsoft already provide you. I just want to highlight that. So historically, when we look at especially the SMS fraud, there are certain regions where we see more influx of those. So what we did is Microsoft now require you to opt in. So for example, if you're planning to go live, generally speaking, there are regions where we see a lot of attacks emerge. We don't allow like SMS to go to that particular network, right? So that country code. However, I mean, if you have a legitimate need, you can go ahead and work with the support and they will enable it for you. Of course, this is something that you wanted to plan. So in your deployment, so you have to do it upfront. Overall, the benefit is that if you need it, you can do it. But generally speaking, there are certain regions where we see attacks are more prevalent. So it's just much better to not have them and then opt in as needed. The other thing is that what you can do, and it's highly recommended, is to basically monitor and alert when the excessive number of SMS OTPs, that's what basically send out, from a same IP address or a region. Now you can do that very easily with the Azure Monitor. You can see that the influx is happening, and you can see that single IP address or ASN is just sending way too many requests. And most of the time, those OTP requests are not going to fulfill because again, the attacker is not necessarily interested in completing the flow. They just basically wanted to send the OTP and that is good enough. So once these type of activities are taking place, you can set up a alert and that will trigger. Now again, this is a proactive way. This is a reactive way of doing that. But it definitely going to report that and it will tell you where to tune. Maybe you wanted to go and have conditional access policy during the sign-in, which just completely block a certain region temporarily, maybe. So you can do that. There are a couple of other things. For example, I was talking about the location-based control. So conditional access policy during the sign-in, you can actually use IP address range, or you can use a region, depending how you want to do it. You can apply that. You can basically tighten it up, and you can say that I don't want it to have sign in from this region. And again, maybe that's a region where there's a lot of traffic coming from, or you can enforce the MFA based on the region. So you can do certain things, and again, you may want to deploy them in a report only mode, and then you basically elevate them to actually being enforced. Another thing that you can do from a user account, like a password spray type attacks, is you can set up an alert that basically going to trigger when the authentication failure exceed a certain window. For example, 10% within 30 minutes, something like that. So it's basically to drive visibility and where you want to tune. Now, again, this is not a holistic list, but something to think about when you're looking at the deployment from the end user security standpoint. Now, let's get into details around the operations side of it, because operations monitoring is going to be really critical, and we're talking about it in bits and pieces. So holistically, how you should think about from a deployment standpoint. So the first thing that you will need to do is you need to make sure the logs are available. So if you're using WAF, you want to funnel that logs into Azure Monitor. If you have the basically we Entra External Identity have audit logs, sign-in logs. These are the logs that are available. You basically go and funnel them into Azure Monitor. And one of the reasons you want to do that, because each of these logs have a certain retention or the box retention period, and after that, they're not retained by the Entra External ID. So if you wanted to retain them, you can basically send them to some other sources. So you can send them to actually multiple places. You can send them to for the retention. You can retain them on the Azure storage. You can also send them to a third party through Azure Event Hub. So you basically stream it over there, and from there you can send it to third party if you're using those. The most common one is the Azure Monitor. So Azure Monitor actually allow you to retain the logs. You can do the ad hoc reporting. You can do the dashboarding. You can also do the alerting. And then on top of that, if you have Sentinel, you can do a full incident response and threat analysis on it. So again, the idea is that you bring all the logs. So the web application logs are usually very rich in terms of the actual threats like DDoS, bot-driven attacks, how many times the geofencing rules are basically set up, and all those things, right? Where the traffic is coming from at a very high level, all the way down to the actual protocol details. So you want to capture that and funnel that into the Azure Monitor. And then you also wanted to do telemetry on the downstream dependencies. For example, we talk about the custom extension. Custom extensions are basically REST APIs. So now every time you're making a call, how much time it take, how much time, the response took. So you wanted to have that telemetry to make a decision where, for example, the delays are, where the optimization can be. Because again, whenever the network is involved, there would be failures, there would be delays. So you wanted to look at those from a uh, with a lens of like data analytics first. Now, again, we provide quite a bit of experiences out of the box. For example, on the left-hand side, there is this dashboard, which is basically showing you the monthly active user, basically looking at the inactive users, and things like that, total number of users. So you basically get the basic telemetry. But if you wanted to go and create even more advanced rules, right? I mean, you want to go ahead and create rule like, for example, the MFA success drop, you know, below 95%, right? And that is something that you wanted to get an alert on, you can do that. Um, you can basically, again, so this is something that is available in Azure Monitor. Out of the box dashboard provide you telemetry around the authentication, the usage patterns. So you basically get a lot of trend information. And then you can actually use for the operation monitoring Azure Monitor to actually fine tune and get very specific alert and reporting. One thing I do wanted to call out is that for successful deployment, because customer identity solutions usually require you to have native applications like mobile, web, APIs, branding, having a validation, and again, validation that basically covers end to end. So applications, your middleware, your backend. If you can do load testing with close to the actual load, so this can be synthetic transactions. That will help you understand your choking points, because again, while the Entra external identity, we'll talk about the service limits and the scale will provide like the best of the class scale. Um, what we have seen is when you build such a rich sort of like a solution on top of that, it just require everything to be fully like tested. So if you're going to make a call again to your downstream API, it has to scale the same way, right? So I mean, if, for example, if you can host it on say Azure with Azure Function, I mean, that's fine, it will scale. But if it's a more like a call to some third party, then you need to understand what are their service limits look like. Um, Now talking about the service limits, this is something you definitely wanted to look at. And again, the link to the documentation will provide you the most current up-to-date information. So I don't want to put numbers here because they become stale, because we're heavily investing in this area. But you have to think about like how many users are going to be consuming this service. What would be the endpoint request look like? So remember, there would be requests going for the authentication and authorization. So that is an area where you need to think about like what the load will look like. The SMS I talk about, the telephony throttling limits. So that will be the opt-in for certain regions. So you need to understand like what the limits look like. And because SMS is so much dependent on other factors, um, that is something that you also need to think about from like which region you operate in. So again, that's a deployment planning thing, right? Like where the limit's going to be. So again, service limit is something that you probably wanted to look at very early on, and especially if you have downstream dependencies, so you can work with them. Again, this is something that maybe initially, from a development standpoint, doesn't really come in conversation that often, but it's probably one of the key things that you want to do. Um, Now let me do this. Let me share the resources here where you can go and look at what's going on from the feature standpoint. We publish our roadmap, like the new features that we are announcing, pricing, and all the good documentation and samples. We have samples are pretty much everything that I talked about today. Native authentication, user flows, authentication support, like protocol support, WAF integration. We have prescriptive guidance around those. So please go and look at that. And yeah, I do want to call out that for the first 50,000 MAU that occurs, you don't incur any cost. So basically, the first 50,000 authentications are basically free. So you can take that into account too. So let me take a pause here. I do want to take questions at this point, so I will go ahead and look at the window there.
Yeah. Thank you, Razi. First off, appreciate the awesome presentation. And there are a few questions in the chat. First one is, can I bring my own web application firewall and integrate it with Microsoft Entra External ID?
Yeah, so you can. The Entra External Identity, the way you do it is you need to have a custom URL domain. That's how you actually technically prove that you can enable a WAF, and you can basically bring any WAF. And we partnered with some of the industry leading WAFs. So if you go to the documentation page, you will see, and we're expanding that partnerships. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, we highly recommend using WAF, and if you already have a WAF in the ecosystem, you can use that. Or if you wanted to bring some other WAF, or if you wanted to expand on third party, absolutely, yeah, we support that.
Amazing, thanks. And let's see, we have another one here. What authentication methods are currently supported for users sign up and sign in?
Yeah, so authentication today, well, at the time of this recording, we have the user and password. I mean, that's that we support. Email, OTP is another one. And then we also have the SMS base as a second factor for the MFA. So we support that. We will be bringing in like a passwordless pass keys, and the what we call like the TOTP, also known as like authenticator base. So those are in the roadmap.
Awesome. Thanks for going over some of the roadmap items. I know people always love those.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun times. And just to remember, there's a few more questions, but I'm always going to encourage, we have over 10 minutes left for people in the audience. If you have more questions, we have an external ID expert on the call, so please post. But we'll move on to the next question. Can I enforce MFA using conditional access policies tailored to my business requirements? For example, triggering MFA based on specific regions or IP address ranges.
Yeah, so absolutely, and that's where conditional access policies are really effective. For example, I mentioned the use case. If you wanted to, let's say, implement adaptive MFA, so you're basically signing in, and you're basically going to want the second factor kick in if you're signing in from a certain region, maybe certain IP range. And again, that can be based on the business need, because in certain regions you don't necessarily operate at that level, right? So you wanted to have that extra level of layer of defense, sort of, right, in addition to WAF I was talking about. So yes, absolutely, you can do that. And again, with the conditional access, we keep adding more parameters to it. So I'll just give you one example, but yeah, absolutely, you can you should be using conditional access with it.
Great. Thank you for that answer. And we have another question. If needed, is it possible to send logs to destinations other than Azure Monitor, such as third-party SIAM platforms, if that's what my organization uses?
Yeah, so Entra External Identity, like Entra, allow you to basically send or stream the logs to multiple sources. So you can do it to the Azure storage, you can do it to the Azure Monitor, but you can also do it to some other third party. Typically the way you do it, you send it to the Azure Event Hub, and from there, the other third parties can pick it up because it provides a standard interface. That's typically, but yeah, you can do that if you need to, and you already have some third party in your ecosystem. You can basically funnel the logs through that stream.
Great, thank you for that answer, Razi. We don't have any more questions that have come in. So I think that is it for today. Thank you so much for coming on. Please come again. And for everyone in the audience, this will be posted on our YouTube page in the next 24 to 48 hours. I appreciate you all coming on to this live event. And thank you, Razi, once again.